After the political transition of South Africa in the 1990s, commentators eagerly declared that the Afrikaner was dead. Several well-known Afrikaners in the media, arts and academic world made a fuss about laying down their Afrikanerhood and supposedly resigning as Afrikaners. The word Afrikaner, that simple word that is supposed to mean not much more nor much less than a reference to us as a cultural community, became a controversial word. Just calling yourself an Afrikaner was controversial. Many of us instead spoke of the Afrikaans-speaking people, as if Afrikaans-speaking people and Afrikaners are synonymous. In other words, as if all Afrikaans-speaking people are also Afrikaners. At that time, it was not difficult to believe that there would not be Afrikaners in the future. All the signs were there that we were on the verge of extinction. In South Africa, we were blamed for every conceivable problem. In the eyes of the world, we were portrayed as villains. The winds of change were so strong that any attempt to take a stance against this narrative was met with accusations of narrow-mindedness and even racism. But that's not all. Almost every historical Afrikaner organization of the 1980s collapsed. One Afrikaans media leader even declared, "When I think of the word Afrikaner, I think of a cow that is dying." A wordplay, of course, on the fact that a particular type of cattle is also called an Afrikaner. Even on the conservative side of the spectrum, people declared that the Afrikaner had lost its soul and that it was dying. We were a discredited, marginalized, directionless and leaderless group of people. Most were convinced that the only future for us was one in which we renounced our cultural identity and enthusiastically participated in the new South African experiment. An experiment based on the assumption that the people as a cultural community must die for the rainbow nation to rise. That a successful new South Africa required that there must be no more Afrikaners. Or, put differently, that the Afrikaners must become only South Africans. There is much to complain about today. We do indeed have many problems and challenges internally and externally, but especially externally. Yet it is hard to believe today that just 2 decades ago, we were in the condition that I described above. But before I say more about this, let's take a moment to remind ourselves why we are here today and how we got here. Today is December 16, 2024. 186 years since the Battle of Blood River was fought in 1838. We commemorate this day as a day of thanksgiving like a Sabbath, not because we commemorate the blood, sweat and tears of the battle, but because our ancestors made a vow to God to which we regard ourselves as bound. We, the Afrikaners, have lived here on the southern tip of the African continent for almost 400 years. Our ancestors originally came from the Netherlands, but were later supplemented by French Huguenots and immigrants from Germany. Here, the Dutch East India Company established a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. The aim was to provide fresh food and water to ships that had to travel all the way around Africa to trade with the East. The Dutch, led by Jan van Riebeeck, managed the refreshment station, They met local people such as the Khoi and the San here, establishing good relations and cooperation where they could, but there was also, in some cases, conflict. Now, contrary to popular contemporary belief, South Africa, as we know it today, was sparsely populated at the time. There are no reliable sources to indicate what the population of this territory was at the time, but certain estimates state that there were somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 people. To put this in perspective, the population of the whole of South Africa, as we know it today, back then, was about 2 or 3 centurions, or about 1/2 of Soweto. So on the one hand, we should not believe the myth that South Africa was a densely populated country that was simply disrupted by the arrival of our European ancestors. But on the other hand, we should not believe that South Africa was simply empty. The truth was that there were people here, many of which arrived from the north not long before us, that we worked to maintain good relations, that our ancestors sometimes made mistakes, that there was sometimes conflict, but that there is an incredible richness in our history of cooperation and mutual respect with other communities here in Africa. A history that is not talked about enough today. As early as 1707, the word Afrikaaner was used for the first time to refer to our identity as a community connected to Africa, when the young Hendrik Bibou declared in response to the magistrate's threat to deport him, "Ek ben een Afrikaner," I am an Afrikaner. However, the Cape was annexed by England in 1795 and then again in 1806, the biggest factor that led to the Great Trek of the 1830s. That incredible event when our ancestors decided that they would rather move into the unknown African continent than be dominated by another nation. It is sometimes claimed that the Great Trek took place to seize land and because the Voortrekkers, that is the Afrikaners or the Boers who moved out ahead during the Great Trek, did not want to abolish slavery. However, this is not true. In his manifesto of 1837, Piet Retief declared that they reject slavery and that they were moving inland in an effort to promote good relations with local peoples they would encounter during their trip. There were several battles during the Great Trek, of which the Battle of Blood River is obviously the most famous, but this was only one in a series of examples. Let us take the Battle of Vegkop, 2 years before the Battle of Blood River, as an example. The Ndebele's under King Msilikatsi sent an army of 5,000 warriors to attack Hendrik Potgieter's camp. Potgieter had heard that the Ndebele's were on their way and immediately began preparations. They drew up the wagons into a laager and closed the spaces between the wagons with thorn branches. But Potgieter only had 35 men to defend themselves against 5,000 Ndebele's. On the morning of the attack, the 35 Voortrekker men decided to go out and meet the 5,000 Ndebele's in the field. They fought in the field all morning and returned to the camp at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and enclosed themselves. There the battle broke out in full force. The men did not fight alone. The women and children helped. Each man had 2 muzzle-loading rifles. While the men were shooting, the women and children stood behind them, sliding gunpowder and bullets down the barrels to reload them. The women kept pots of boiling water ready to throw at the attackers when they entered the camp. Axes and tent pegs were also used for this purpose. The weapons became so hot that they could no longer be touched. To load them, they had to spit the bullets into the barrels. One of these young boys who helped during the attack was only 11 years old, and his name was Paul Kruger, who would later become the president of the South African Republic, or the Transvaal as it was also known. There were more than 150 Ndebele warriors for every Voortrekker. By the time 430 Ndebele bodies had piled up around the camp, they decided to retreat. The force of 5,000 could only kill 2 of the Voortrekkers. On the 6th of June 1837, the Afrikaners participating in the Great Trek had the first democratic election in the history of South Africa. At this election, they elected Piet Retief, who was soon inaugurated as the first leader of the Great Trek, and Gerrit Maritz as judge president. Retief went out of his way in his belief that an agreement could be made with the Zulu king Dingaan to buy land. A small group of Voortrekkers under his leadership set out and met the Zulu king in his kraal in Mkungundlovu. A treaty was concluded between Retief and Dingaan, according to which the Voortrekkers could buy land from the Zulus in exchange for the return of cattle stolen from the Zulus by the Tlokwas. Retief fulfilled his part of the agreement and shortly afterwards brought almost 70,000 cattle to Dingaan. After the cattle were handed over, the Zulu king signed the treaty on the 6th of February 1838. Afterwards, Piet Retief, his son and about 100 of his men were captured by the Zulu king and slaughtered alive on KwaMatiwani Hill nearby. Retief was killed last so that he could watch his commando and his son being killed. After the murder of Retief and his commando, the Zulu king ordered that the Voortrekker camps in the nearby vicinity be attacked. On 17 February, the Voortrekker camps were unexpectedly attacked at Wenen, Doornkop, Blaukrans, Moordspruit, Rensburgspruit, and other areas. Among the Voortrekkers, 41 men, 56 women, and 185 children were killed. A further 250 Khoikhoi and Basotho who accompanied the Voortrekkers were also killed here. The Boer woman, Johanna van der Merwe, was stabbed 21 times with an assegai, but survived the attack. The Voortrekkers responded by forming a punitive commando with the aim of dethroning the Zulu king. A number of battles took place, including the Battle of Italeni, where Piet Uys and his son Dirkie Uys, one of our great child heroes, were killed. The Battle of Blood River took place on 16 December 1838. 10 days before the battle, the tracker leader, Andries Pretorius, received information that the Zulus were planning to attack them. The vow was repeated from then on every day until the Great Battle. On 15 December, the Voortrekkers crossed the Buffalo River and were approximately 50 kilometers from Mkungundlovu. Pretorius received information that there were Zulu forces in the area and immediately gave instructions that the wagons be drawn into a laager. That evening, a thick layer of fog fell over the camp, which contributed to them not being attacked at night. According to legend, the lanterns in the fog created the impression of angels protecting the Voortrekkers at night. On the morning of 16 December, the Voortrekkers awoke to find that the whole of Zululand, as they had put it, were sitting on the hills around them. 470 Voortrekkers were surrounded by roughly 12,000 Zulu warriors. It was within this context that the Voortrekkers, led by their spiritual leader Sarel Selia, made their final declaration as follows. Here we stand before the holy God of heaven and earth to make a vow to him that if he will protect us and deliver our enemy into our hands, we will spend the day and date every year as a day of thanksgiving, like a Sabbath, to his honor, and that we will build a house to his honor where it pleases him, and that we will also tell our children that they should share it in memory with us also for the generations to come. For the honor of his name will be glorified by giving the fame and honor of victory to him. The attack took place, and after about 3 hours, 3 Voortrekkers were wounded and about 3,000 Zulus were killed. The river was stained red by the blood, which is why the battle became known as the Battle of Blood River. The Zulus fled, and victory belonged to the Boers. 4 days later, the Voortrekkers reached Umkhonto only to find that the kraal was abandoned and burned down. Retief's bones and the treaty were also found there. 2 years later, the Zulu king Dingaan's brother Mpande formed an alliance with the Voortrekkers and finally defeated Dingaan's forces. After the Great Trek, the Boers established several independent self-governing republics. These included the South African Republic, the Republic of the Orange Free State, the Natalia Republic, the Republic of Swellendam, the Republic of Graaf Reinet, the New Republic, the Soutpansberg Republic, the Republic of Goosen, Winburg, Potchefstroom, Kliprivier, Leidenburg, Utrecht, Klein Vrystaat, Stelleland and Appingtonia or Leidensrust. But the southern tip of Africa was strategically of great importance to the British, which was at the time the most powerful empire in the world, especially after gold and diamonds were discovered here. This led to the First Anglo-Boer War in 1880, or as we call it, the First War of Independence. Here, a small people in the southern tip of Africa finally defeated the mighty British army at the Battle of Majuba. The English occupied the mountain of Majuba at night, which of course gave them an enormous strategic advantage. A Boer scout told General Piet Joubert, who was in charge of the Boer forces at the time, that the English were on top of the mountain. Legend has it that his wife, Drini Joubert, who was with them in the field, responded like a typical Afrikaner woman with the words, "Well, what are you waiting for? Go and get them." Despite the fact that the Boers had to shoot and load while climbing up the mountain, while the English could simply shoot down from behind their shelters on top of the mountain, the Boers won the battle. 1 Boer was killed and 5 were wounded. On the English side, 92 were shot dead, 134 were wounded, and 59 were captured. This marked the end of the war, and the Battle of Majuba is still described as one of the most humiliating defeats the British Empire has ever had to endure. So humiliating that to this day, people still tease the English with the words, "Remember Majuba." But after the Battle of Majuba, it was not long before England was back. And so the Second Anglo-Boer War, or for us, the Second War of Independence, began in 1899. The English boasted that the war would be over before Christmas, but little did they know what would befall them. Later, the English were mocked for never saying by which Christmas the war would be over. It was in this war that relatively unknown Boer soldiers, who were not professional soldiers, became internationally respected militarists. The concept of guerrilla warfare was perfected here. It was also the first war where camouflage was used. The tactics of Generals Christian de Wet, Koos de la Rey and others are still studied at military schools today. during this Second War of Independence, or Second Anglo-Boer War, more than 500,000 people fought on the side of the British, and about 70,000 on the Boer side. We were outnumbered almost 10 to 1. Yet, about 100,000 soldiers died on the British side compared to about 50,000 on the Boer side. But the great tragedy of this war was not simply the number of people who died in combat. The British seized the two capitals, Bloemfontein and Pretoria, quite early in the war, and according to their conventional approach, this meant that the war was over. But this was when the Boers switched to guerrilla warfare on a large scale. The English did not know how to react to this and were frustrated with the situation, which is why Lord Kitchener announced that England would implement a scorched earth policy. British forces were ordered to destroy Boer farms, kill the animals, and burn down homesteads and crops, and to put women and children in concentration camps. This was the first time in history that concentration camps had been implemented on this scale. As a result, about 30,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, and about 20,000 more from black communities affected by the war. This ultimately forced the Boers to sign a peace treaty with the British Empire for the sake of the survival of our people, despite the fact that we had achieved one spectacular military victory after the other. After the war, the country was devastated. Jan Smuts later noted that the few years after the war were even worse than the war itself. Afrikaners were emotionally and financially devastated. Our farms had been destroyed. Many of our men, women and children had died in the war. And above all, we were now dominated by another nation. We had to swear an oath of allegiance to the crown that had brought this grief upon us. After the war, there was much talk of compensation to pay the Boers for the damage done during the war. However, the compensation process became a farce. Much of the so-called compensation money was used to repair destroyed infrastructure, such as railway tracks. Little real compensation was forthcoming. Farmers received small amounts of money from England, which in many cases they had to use to buy back their own livestock and implements that were taken from them in the first place. Our ancestors quickly learned that compensation for historical events might just do more harm than good. The problem with compensation is that it makes your people more dependent rather than self-sufficient. The territory of South Africa was united in 1910 into one large union of South Africa. The borders we know today were actually imposed on us from outside against our will. We wanted to govern ourselves on a much smaller piece of land. Our ancestors realized that they would have to roll up their sleeves themselves. There were many stories of women who returned alone to destroyed farms and got the farms back on its feet all by themselves. There are even stories of women who lined themselves up like oxen before a plow to till the land themselves. Once again, a confirmation of the strength of the Afrikaner woman, and once again, a reason why it is wonderful to be an Afrikaner. Because I'm not aware of a single nation anywhere else in the world where their women have had to make such sacrifices so frequently. But for our ancestors, rolling up their sleeves was not that easy, because there was not much to work with. Just as the Afrikaners were beginning to find their feet again, another tragedy broke out. The First World War, or the Great War as it was initially called. Today we easily forget the huge impact that the Boer Wars had in the run-up to the First World War. In Margaret Macmillan's book, The War That Ended Peace, she discusses the run-up to the Great War in an attempt to answer the question: if the world had become so enlightened, and if trade and mutual interaction, and even dependence between countries in Europe in particular, were at such a peak, how did it happen that these countries decided to wage such a devastating war against each other? The answer is, of course, complex, involving a variety of factors. But we must remember that the First World War took place with our own wars fresh in the world's memory. In her book, the Boer War, especially the Second Anglo-Boer War, is referenced 26 times, precisely because it had such a huge impact on the world. The impact of the Boer War in the run-up to the First World War can be summarized as follows. Firstly, in many ways, it can be described as the first international media and propaganda war in which international opinion was almost as important as what happened in the field. Secondly, public sentiment in the rest of the world, and especially in Europe, was overwhelmingly on the side of the Boers. Not only that, the war, which was seen by many as immoral, led to the development of a kind of resentment towards the British Empire. The Anglo-Boer War here in the southern tip of Africa was the first major event in the fight against imperialism. Thirdly, this resentment intensified when the world began to learn about the brutality of the concentration camps and the women and children who died in these camps. Fourthly, the fact that it was not so easy for England to win the war, that the war was indeed not over by Christmas as initially announced, but that a small group of Boers or farmers could hold out for 3 years against the most powerful military empire in the world, and in the process achieve several spectacular military victories, sent a message to the rest of the world that England was not as powerful as they wanted them to believe. And in the fifth place, there were also several political intrigues and even scandals in Europe surrounding this war, such as when a British minister in France was booed by a group of French Boer supporters with the words, "Long live the Boers," and when the Emperor of Germany sent a telegram to Paul Kruger to congratulate the Boers on stopping the Jameson raid, which led to considerable friction between Germany and Queen Victoria. The First World War caused tragedy here in its own unique way in the southern tip of Africa. The Afrikaner leadership at the time saw fit to invade German Southwest Africa, today Namibia, under British direction to conquer it for England. Many Afrikaners, including several great heroes of the Boer War, believed that it would be immoral to now declare war in support of the nation that had waged a devastating war against us barely a decade earlier, against a nation that had supported us in that war. This initial disagreement, with heroes such as Generals Koos de la Rey, Christian de Wet and Christian Beyers on the one hand, and Generals Jan Smuts and Louis Botha on the other, soon led to a rebellion and ultimately a mini-civil war among Afrikaners. During the rebellion of 1914, friends and family fought each other in the field and in some cases even shot and killed each other. More than 200 people died during the rebellion. The rebellion was eventually crushed after the execution of Commander Jopie Fourie in December 1914 and the subsequent Battle of Uppington in January 1915. This event further set back the Afrikaners' attempt to rise up again after the devastating Boer War. The rebels were fined and claims against them amounted to £340,000 at the time, but there was no money to pay it. From this financial ruin, Afrikaners began to mobilize to lift themselves up again. The Helping Hand was launched on the 6th of March 1915, when 500 people met in Bethlehem to raise funds. Here too, our women came to the forefront to lift our people out of the rubble. Women and children baked milk tarts and other pastries and shook tin cans to raise money to pay for the rebels' fines. They raised £231,863 in 1915 and 367,100 by 1917. If this amount is converted to rand, it means that the Help Mekaar movement of the 1910s, in the midst of financial distress, raised an amount that would amount to more than 175 million rands in today's value. The Help Mekaar movement was a remarkable part of our history and perhaps the most underrated. After the devastation of the Second Anglo-Boer War, and then the rebellion and the First World War, and then on top of that, during the Great Flu and the global Great Depression, our ancestors came together under the slogan of Father Kestel, "A people saves itself." We realized that we were only able to rise up again if we take ownership of our own future. We discovered the liberating wisdom that our future is indeed in our own hands and that dependency is the enemy of prosperity. Therefore, we turned towards the community and began to build community institutions. We realized that each person is unique and can use their unique talents and abilities in a unique way for the greater good. We also realized, and again reconfirmed, that men must act like men and women like women. This is because we realized that in our culture and in Western tradition, there are certain tasks for which men are better equipped, for which they must accept responsibility, and certain tasks for which women are better equipped, for which they must accept responsibility. No matter what the world has to say about that today. However, we do not work in isolation. We support and strengthen each other in these tasks because we are also a unity. At the Volkskongress of 1939, 3 institutions were created: a finance house, a chamber of commerce, and an organization that was to help with a financial rescue operation. Afrikaners were encouraged to make conventional investments in healthy Afrikaner enterprises. One of the first loans was made to a small company belonging to an ambitious young entrepreneur named Anton Rupert, who would eventually become arguably the best known entrepreneur of the African continent. It is this Help Mekaar movement that led to the founding of what would later become major corporations such as Volkskas, Sanlam and Remgro, to name just a few. The historian Herman Gilumea writes that Afrikaners had to earn their respect by setting up successful enterprises themselves. In 1999, Gilumea asked Rupert if he could think of any Afrikaans company that had been empowered by an English company. To which Rupert responded, "Not one, and I am very grateful for that." Now let me take a moment to say something about our culture. Our language, Afrikaans, is one of only 3 languages that developed into a scientific language in the previous century. With the delivery of the first legal judgment in the Court of Appeals in Bloemfontein in the early 1930s, it was clear that Afrikaans had developed into a fully fledged legal language. But it also quickly became an academic language. The first MBA program outside North America was offered at the University of Pretoria in 1949. in Afrikaans. Today there are about 1 million words in the Afrikaans language, and this young language of ours is still growing. During this time, so many great poets and writers have come to the fore that it would be an injustice to attempt to provide a list here. But let me, for the sake of the argument, cite just one. N.P. van Wyk Louw, the man after whom academia's think tank is also named. Louw said that the flow of ideas is as important to a people as the circulation of blood is to the body. He advocated that we must maintain the balance between our unique Afrikaner culture and identity and our identity as part of Western civilization, where we can add much value to the international conversation from our own unique experience. He argued that culture is the backbone of a nation. And when a critic asked him what a person of culture is supposed to do when a nation finds itself in times of crisis, he said that the answer is easy. Just keep going. Culture must be promoted when the sun shines on us, but also when the thunder clouds emerge. Culture sustains us when times are tough, and it gives us direction when we experience uncertainty. Culture is something that must be both pursued and promoted at the same time, because our culture protects us while we protect our culture. Culture sustains us while we maintain our culture. This is because culture is not just some item in our possession. Culture is the deepest part of who we are. We and our culture are one. If we perish, our culture perishes. And if our culture perishes, we perish too. So when we are going through troubling times and when we are not sure what to do, we can rest assured that if we are working on preserving and promoting our culture, we are busy with the solution. It is almost inconceivable how this country, from total destruction in the aftermath of the war, the rebellion, the Great Depression, was built up into the most successful country on the African continent, on par with our European counterparts. In fact, by 1771, $1 cost 72 cents in South African rand. The tremendous flourishing of Afrikaner institutions led to new self-confidence, enthusiasm, and spirit among our people. In 1948, the more conservative National Party, led by the theologian Dr. D.F. Malan, took power. The policy of separate development that was advocated for at that time was first and foremost a recognition that South Africa was diverse and consisted of several peoples who each had a unique culture and who had to govern themselves in their own homelands. This policy over time became known as apartheid. At that stage, racial segregation was not only the practice in South Africa but throughout much of the world. But, as Tony Leon rightly points out, none of these other countries that also advocated such policy ideas went through the trouble of codifying their racial policy ideas in such detail. This made the Afrikaners an easy moral target, but also, relatively speaking, an easy target. In the second half of the 20th century, the Afrikaners did many things right, for which we do not receive recognition today. This includes the unprecedented pace at which the country was industrialized, during which infrastructure was laid down, the economy strengthened, and also during which we actively worked to keep out destructive ideas such as communism. Now, we could surely debate today about the methods that were used to try to prevent a communist takeover in South Africa, such as the adoption of the Suppression of Communism Act, which was of course regarded as an oppression of freedom of opinion. But one of our great achievements during this time is, of course, becoming a republic. The fact that we were finally able to free ourselves from British rule and govern ourselves again. However, these achievements were overshadowed by the political history of especially the 1970s and 80s. Now, every second analyst today is eager to tell us just what went wrong, how evil we were, or perhaps how evil we still are, and how we should think about our own history. But here is an important principle that we must not forget. It is important to listen to the criticisms of others. But as a people, we should never allow ourselves to be told by others how to think about our own history, especially not by groups or individuals who relish in any suffering that they could inflict on us, and who would wish so hard that we would disappear like mist before the sun. We should, when we talk among each other, have difficult conversations about the past. We do not need to argue about whether things went wrong, because we all know that it did. The question is why things went wrong. This is, of course, a question that requires a long answer, but let me just give a few points in this regard. Firstly, the fact that so-called grand apartheid, the idea that each cultural group should govern themselves, eventually became small apartheid, by which beaches, streets, and even benches were allocated to different groups based on the color of their skin. Secondly, blatant atrocities that were also committed during these times, such as tortures at Vlakplaas and the death of the black consciousness activist Steve Biko while he was in police detention. Also, labor policy, by which we believed that it was good for different groups to govern themselves in their own places, but where we were at the same time dependent on those groups that could not stay among us to do our labor in the areas in which they were not allowed to live, which is obviously a bad and unsustainable idea. But the more underlying factor of all of this, the fact that we who were once community builders became state builders. Afrikaners made a giant leap from community as the solution to the state as the solution during the second half of the 20th century. Now, one does not have to be an anarchist to warn against a big state. Criticism of the big state does not necessarily mean that one doesn't want a state at all. But our fundamental mistake was to build a state that was so big and so strong, so centralized, that it was no longer necessary or even possible for us to solve our own problems. The state had to fix every societal issues and often made it worse. When we experienced some problem, we simply asked the state to solve it for us. We no longer even needed to worry about how to raise our children, because even here the state began to take over the work of the parents and the community. And then something happened that the political authorities of the second half of the 20th century simply did not want to account for. The state was taken over, and this leviathan that we ourselves had fed turned against us. With the support of Russia and other communist-oriented countries, and through a violent people's war strategy with which a bloody war was waged not against the Afrikaners or the government, but against rival black organizations such as Inkatha, Azapu, and the Black Consciousness Movement, combined with a masterful propaganda campaign, the ANC, the African National Congress, succeeded in winning the support of the international community. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the government, along with the rest of the Western world, believed that communism had been defeated, and that now was the ideal time to negotiate with the ANC for a new South Africa. These negotiations culminated in the ANC takeover in 1994, and so we ended up in the situation to which I referred to at the very beginning of this speech. But was the Afrikaner really defeated. Karel Boshoff argues that the Afrikaners went through several phases in their development and that today we can in a sense be described as the third Afrikaner. The first Afrikaner was the Afrikaner in his formative years, the Afrikaners of the Cape and the Great Track, who established the Boer republics. This Afrikaner fell after the devastating war and then rose again. The second Afrikaner was the Afrikaners of the previous dispensation. These were the Afrikaners of the Help Mekaar movement, the Help Each Other movement, the industrializers, the modernizers, but also the great state builders. These Afrikaners also fell eventually, and then we, the third Afrikaner, rose from the ashes. But this metaphor shouldn't be pushed too far because it doesn't mean that the Afrikaners actually died and came back to life. We are still connected to our ancestors, but we have new experience and we have a new perspective, and therefore we think anew about problems and solutions. The third Afrikaner, us today, are still inspired by the Great Track, and we commemorate the vow of 1838, today more than at any time in the past few decades. The Republican spirit of our ancestors still beats through our veins as much as ever. We are still inspired, and especially today we are inspired by the words of Paul Kruger, that we must take the good and the beautiful from the past and base our ideals on them when working for a better future. We are more inspired than ever by the achievements of the Help Mekaar movement and the idea that a people saves itself, that communities must find their own solutions. But unlike a few decades ago, we are considerably more skeptical of the state as the solution. Just as after the Second Anglo-Boer War, it took us about 2 decades to find our feet and organize ourselves again. But we are there now. That is why we consolidate today under the slogan, Ons sal self. We will do it ourselves. Because we have rediscovered that old wisdom, that the only way to prosperity and success lies through self-help. In the process, we have achieved unimaginable achievements, where the Afrikaners were crushed only 3 decades ago, and where almost none of our organizations survived the political transition of the 1990s. Today we boast a network of more than 50 institutions, with more than 700,000 members who contribute monthly to the work of the various institutions in the Solidarity movement. And with that, I'm not even talking about our volunteers. But above all, and precisely as a result of this attitude, the Afrikaner is being rediscovered in the rest of the world today. As the South African dispensation fails, and as the reality sinks in that the settlement of 1994 was not the great miracle that was so celebrated, as the world becomes aware of crime and corruption and the torrent of racial laws engulfing the country, the Afrikaners are being rediscovered, especially as a result of the solutions that we are working for. South Africa has in many ways become the first post-Western society. There are many countries in Africa and so on that were colonized and later liberated again, but none of these countries became Western societies to the extent that South Africa became Western. We are becoming, or we are told that we are becoming, a source of inspiration for our friends in the West, who are increasingly realizing that the future has already happened, even though it is not evenly distributed. The future has already happened in South Africa in the sense that we have been struggling for some time now with problems that for much of the world, and the Western world in particular, still lie ahead. But the future has already happened in the sense that Afrikaners were able to succeed in finding ourselves again under these circumstances. And because we realize that by finding comfort and hope in our faith in God, by remaining anchored in the past, by learning lessons from our experience in the present, and by setting our eyes on the future, we are bringing that dream a little closer to reality every day. Hi, I'm Adam Strutz. If you support this podcast and the work that we are involved with as the Afrikaner Foundation and the broader solidarity movement in South Africa, I want to encourage you to become a more active supporter. You can do this first and foremost by subscribing to our various social media channels, by leaving a comment and sharing what you have seen. But other than that, also by making a small monthly contribution to the work that we are doing through the Afrikaner Foundation's website, or by making a once-off donation. Links in the description.